Thank you again for joining us tonight for How Do Habitat Features and Climate Change Impact Cavity Nesting Birds and Owls. I'm really glad that you've joined us tonight for this presentation. It's going to be really great content, and you're going to get to meet another member of the HawkWatch International team. These presentations are made possible by Salt Lake County ZAP, for those of you who are in Salt Lake County, and also the generosity of people like you who are joining us. So thanks again for being here. I'm joined tonight by Kassandra Townsend. She's a graduate research associate with HawkWatch International. She received her BS in Ecology and Conservation Biology at the University of Idaho in Moscow. And after completing that degree, she was accepted into the National Science Foundation Bridge to Doctorate program to pursue her PhD at the University of Idaho. Currently, Kassandra's dissertation work focuses on understanding microclimates within tree cavities, the distribution of forest owls, and how climate change may impact these populations within her study site in the Chiricahua Mountains in Arizona. She was recently selected to be a part of the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship Program, which will provide funding for her work. Although she's been working with us for a little while now, most of you probably haven't had the chance to meet her, so I'm really excited to introduce her to you tonight. Kassandra, thanks for joining us. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to share my screen really quick so I can start my presentation. Okay. So, like Kirsten said, I am new to HawkWatch, so I thought I would start out my presentation with just a little bit about me. And this is pictures of my family and people who have influenced where I am today. I grew up in Idaho, specifically Nampa, Idaho is where I grew up. And I grew up being outdoors. I grew up hiking and camping and backpacking, and my family is very outdoorsy, so we will go fishing together and hike together, and that greatly influenced what I wanted to pursue. And Kirsten talked about it a little bit, but I did complete my associates at the College of Western Idaho in biology with the emphasis in natural resources. During my time there was when I had my very first raptor experience, and that has inspired me to pursue raptor biology. However, I did have other experiences with other species as well, especially when I transferred to University of Idaho and received my bachelor's in ecology and conservation biology. And like Kristen said, I was accepted in the Bridge to Doctorate program, which accepts Indigenous students to pursue a PhD. So I went straight from undergrad into a PhD. And that is what has led me to my topic today. So the title of my topic is How Do Habitat Features and Climate Change Impact Owls and Other Cavity Nesters? This work I just presented to our department as my research proposal. So you guys are seeing what I proposed for my upcoming research. I have had a few seasons already, but this is what I hope to do with the data that I have collected. And I am on Dr. Dave Oliar's project through HawkWatch International, and he has been kind enough to let me build this project off of what he's done, and I'll talk about that later as well. So what I'm going to go over today is a basic overview of climate and forest structure in tree cavities and owls. I'm also going to cover some objectives of my project. I'll talk about the study area where we work and some background information about the area, and then current and past work that's been done there as well. And then my 3 research topics, and finish off with some outreach opportunities and acknowledgements. So first, climate change, always climate change. We know it's going to impact everything, and understanding how species are interacting in their habitats is really important. And understanding how those habitats are impacted is also really important. And this paper I have highlighted here on this slide really points out how forest ecosystems are going to be impacted. They're going to expect a shift to happen in structure and composition of forests, and this is going to impact biodiversity in forests, specifically bird species. This will increase the difficulty of a species to adapt to those climate change influences. And this paper too really points out how understanding multiple scales within a habitat is really important to understand how climate and disturbance and vegetation and wildlife are interacting with each other. And they use this illustration of a Venn diagram to really prove the point that they're trying to get across of looking at climate and forests and avifauna. And each of those topics separately are important, but once you put them all together, you're able to really see how they interact with each other, they influence each other, and understanding each aspect of all of those topics is going to continually be important to understand how climate is interacting with not only just a species, but how they're interacting within their habitat as well. And so that's what I hope to do with my project. I will be approaching this using a multi-scale habitat characteristic outlook. So first, I will look at more large landscape scales. And one way to do this is to consider climate. And like I said before, understanding how species are interacting with their habitat is important, but how do you do this? Well, one way to do this is to understand their adaptive capacity. And what adaptive capacity is basically a species' ability to adapt to climate pressures. And to understand this is by understanding their demography, how they disperse within their habitat, their life history, certain characteristics that they have, and their ability to move within their habitat to much better climate conditions. And if you are focusing on movement, there are two main concepts that have to do with movement. First is to persist in place. So this is an adjustment in time. So an example of this would be like a bird that's arriving to its breeding habitat at an earlier or a later time than historically they have before because of changing climate. Another example would be, or another concept would be to shift in space. So this would be a poleward or upslope movement or lateral movement. So an example of this would be a species that is shifting northward because of climate changing and increasing those temperatures. And so we know that there are broad scale climates interacting with fine scale spatial features. And as climate continues, understanding how these large landscape scales are influencing those smaller spatial scales is going to be continually important because that's directly what a species is experiencing. And so one way to do this is to look at refugia. And if you don't know what refugia is, these are basically pockets of suitable habitat within a landscape. And so if you look at our picture we have here on our slide, this is a picture of Cave Creek Canyon where we work. And I'm just going to point out refugia that we can see within this picture. So first would be valleys with cold air pockets. So where that arrow is pointing is over where the station that we are based out of is at. And that area experiences a cold air pocket that settles there. And so that's really important for these really high temperature areas. Knowing where these cooler pockets of air are would help you deal with those rising temperatures. Next would be like a shaded side of a mountain. So north and east slopes of mountains are known to be much cooler. Alternatively, warmer slopes of mountains could also be really important as well. And then also tree canopies. So tree canopies, which we'll talk about this more, they can reduce the temperature within a forest. And so that would also be important with rising temperatures across a broad landscape. And then lastly, riparian zones. So these are any areas around streams or rivers. Usually these areas tend to be much cooler and also can have higher humidity, which could be important for areas that are really high temperature and are really dry. And so next we'll look at intermediate scale, such as forest structure. And so within a forest, there's a vertical temperature gradient. And what this means is that when you go from the ground of a forest up to the top of a tree in the forest, there's a bunch of different microclimates that you're experiencing. And much of this is due to the composition of the forest. And so we know that the vegetation itself within a forest can influence the temperature within a forest stand. And the understory, so the ground plants within a forest, are buffered or protected against external temperatures, those macroclimate temperatures across a large landscape. And this is an example of that through a study done by Dufresne et al. In 2021. The forest that they were studying found that there is a 0.15 to 0.25 degrees Celsius meter per unit area temperature difference between the ground and the canopy of a forest. And then they also compared that forest stand that they're in to an open forest meadow. And they found that the forested area maintains 4 degrees Celsius cooler in the summer and 1 degree Celsius warmer in the winter compared to an open meadowed area. So this is an example of a refugia on a intermediate scale within a forest stand, but we can also look at refugia on a smaller scale. And so that's what our next step in our multi-scale habitat outline is tree cavities and cavity nesters. So tree cavities are considered refugia, and they're also considered important keystone structures. And essentially what a keystone structure is a structure that occurs within an environment that its availability, other species rely on it just to exist. So if we didn't have any cavities, we wouldn't have cavity nesters such as owls. So these are really important structures that are within forest habitats. And they're formed by our primary excavators. So I have an example of an acorn woodpecker on there, which we commonly get in our study area. And these are our primary excavators that create those really nice excavated circular cavities that we're used to seeing. Cavities can also be formed by fungal or decay processes, and this would form a chimney. So the picture of the owl that you see on your screen, he's sitting in, or she is sitting in a chimney or that decayed out cavity. So there was a branch there one time that had broken and fallen off and formed that cavity. And there's a lot of factors that affect cavity selection. I have a few listed here. So that includes the quality of the cavity, how many cavities are within an area, the competition they're experiencing with each other and between other species, how much predation is occurring within these cavities, and ectoparasitism as well. But one aspect of cavities that is becoming focused on much more within conservation is thermal conditions. So that is the internal temperatures of cavities, microclimates. And these microclimates are really important for cavity nesters because choosing a cavity with the right internal climate can be important for egg and nestling development. And they want to choose cavities that have really good insulation. If these cavities have bad insulation, they'll experience temperatures that are way too high or way too low and past their physiological limit, and that can lead to mortality. And so nestlings are really sensitive to thermal conditions, and this is really important for the adults as well because the insulation of a cavity if there's poor insulation, it can lead to much more energy consumption. And as we know, reproducing and breeding and raising young is really energy consumptive. And so the last thing they need is one more factor that's impacting how much energy they're expending. And so now that we've covered our multi-scale habitat characteristics and what those are, we're going to look at the objectives of my study. So first, we're going to examine owl distributions along an elevational gradient. So where are the owls along each of these elevations that occur within our study site? Second, we're going to look at the probability of occupancy with cavities and how this is influenced by habitat characteristics. So what cavities are these owls occupying and what factors are influencing their use? And then lastly, we're going to analyze cavity tree and stand level characteristics that influence tree cavity microclimates. So what external factors are influencing that internal cavity temperature? And this all will be done within the Madre and Sky Island archipelago. So this is where our study site occurs. This area stretches from the Sierra Madre Occidental down in Mexico all the way up to the Rocky Mountains up north in the US. And this area is really unique because it's a convergence of multiple mountain ranges and it's surrounded by desert. So it contains sky islands. And if you don't know what a sky island is, it's essentially a really high elevation mountain that's surrounded by an ocean of desert. And what makes it really unique is that as you increase in elevation on these sky islands, you have different habitats that occur. So this illustration by the Sky Island Alliance shows how as you increase in elevation, you go from a desert scrub at the base all the way up to a fir forest at the very top. And these are important because Sky Islands have really high biodiversity, and they are considered an area of high conservation value. And so within this mountain range, we will be working in the Chiricahua Mountains. Specifically, we're working in Cave Creek Canyon. This canyon has about 1,100 meters in elevational change, ranging from our lowest point down in Portal to our highest point at Rustler Park. And as you drive up the canyon, you can really see how the habitats change. Just this picture, you can see as you're entering the canyon, there's a lot of shrub and grass cover. But as you continue up the canyon, you experience oaks. And once you get up at the higher elevations, you're in a conifer forest. So it's really unique. And one thing that attracts people to this area are the birds. It is one of the largest and most biologically diverse canyons in the Chiricahua Mountains, and it's frequented by scientists, researchers, tourist groups, campers, and especially birders. It has some species of birds that are only found in this area in the US. And these are a few species that you can find in this canyon, such as the elegant trogon, the Mexican chickadee, the painted redstart, blue-throated hummingbird, and the quetzal. And something that a lot of these species have in common is they are reliant on our primary excavators. So these are a few of our woodpecker species that you can find in the canyon. And another species that is reliant on these guys are our owl species. So we have 6 species of owls that we're focused on for this work. And the elf owl and the whiskered screech owl are the most abundant and regularly encountered species. The elf owl is the world's smallest species of owl we have. And then the western screech owl is our largest owl that we study. And then we also have the flammulated owl and the northern saw-whet owl. These are our high elevation owls. And then we have the northern pygmy owl, which we don't encounter as often. And so current and past work that's been done in this area was started in 2016 by Dr. Dave Oliar of HawkWatch International, and his project focuses on the dynamics of tree cavities in owl populations. And HawkWatch has 2 different sites. They have one in Utah and one in Arizona that does similar work, which includes tree cavity mapping and habitat measurements. They also survey owl communities using pole-mounted cavity cameras and using nighttime callback surveys. And then we also conduct owl captures and banding. And all of this work is done by HawkWatch, but also the help of the Earthwatch Institute. They provide citizen scientists to help us in the field. And I'll talk about them much later. But the overall goal of this project is to understand the dynamics and distributions of tree hollows and their importance to multiple owl species. And so the way my work fits into this is we first will be examining owl distribution. So how is owl presence influenced by elevation, localized ambient temperatures, forest type, and woodpecker presence? And so first we'll look at elevational range. So this is 5 of our 6 owl species. I did not include the pygmy owl just because we don't encounter that species very often. But some things to note is our elf owl and our whiskered screech owl and our western screech owl have really broad elevational ranges. It ranges from 100 meters to 2,000 meters. And that's compared to our flammulated owl and our northern saw-whet owl. They are located at much higher elevations. And so why is this important to know? Well, like I pointed out earlier, our sky islands have that elevational range that allows multiple habitats to be supported. And allowing multiple habitats to be in an area also allows higher biodiversity. So we have the capability to have all of these owl species occurring in this mountain range. But as climate change continues, we're going to see a shift, an upward shift in all of those habitats. We're going to lose the diversity of habitats that are housed in this mountain range, which could also lead to our high elevation species completely losing habitat. And so to understand this, we first need to understand where these owls are located. So one way we're doing this, along with our nighttime surveys, is using passive acoustic monitors. And I have currently 10 set up in the canyon. You can see our low elevation ones in white, our mid elevation ones in pink, and our high elevation ones in red. And they range from about 1,400 meters to 2,400 meters. So these are the ones I currently have in the field. This next summer, I will be deploying 20 more passive acoustic monitors along this elevational range, and they will be recording every 2 hours before and after sunrise and sunset They'll record 1 hour at noon, so that'll potentially get us woodpecker presence and also increase our pygmy owl detection. And then 1 hour at midnight, so we can detect any owls that might be calling in the middle of the night. We'll also be avoiding roads, hiking trails, and highly trafficked public areas to reduce theft and vandalism. And then at each of these units, we'll be measuring temperature. And so this is what it looks like once we get our audio data. And I'm going to play this. Hopefully everybody can hear it. And so this is a visualization of sound. And you can see on the recording these little tick marks that are occurring in the green space. That is an elf owl calling. So hopefully you could hear that. There's a lot of background noise. There's crickets, there's ambient noises happening, which could be wind or it could be just forest noises. But what we can do with this software called Kaleidoscope is we can specify what frequency we want to listen to. So if you look at the left-hand side of this sonogram, you can see there's a little white space that's highlighted. So we're specifying what frequency we'd like to listen at. And then I've also used this box on the actual sonogram to mark where we want to listen. So now when I play this, we're only going to hear noises at that specific frequency and at that specific point in time. So it's still a little fuzzy, but we can hear our owl much more clear. And so using this, we can pull out that recording, plug it back into our software, and it'll give us a list of where all of these owl songs are occurring within our audio. So then we don't have to listen to 1,000 hours of audio recordings and try and find the owls themselves. And so using this owl detection information, we can see whether their locations are being influenced by temperature, elevation, our woodpecker presence, so where those primary excavators are at, and then our forest types as well. And so now moving on to the second chapter of my research, I will be determining the probability of occupancy within cavities and how this is being influenced by various habitat characteristics. So what cavities are these owls occupying, and how is cavity, tree, and stand characteristics influencing their occupancy of these cavities? And then multi-scale interactions is just whether or not multiple characteristics are interacting with each other. And so based on the literature, what we can predict is that our size of cavities will limit accessibility. So as you can imagine, our western screech owl, the largest owl that we study, is going to use a much bigger cavity compared to an elf owl, the world's smallest owl. And so as these cavities decay over time, the width of those cavities will increase, which will allow more access. So we could predict that as cavity size increases, our occupancy will increase. But then there'll probably be a drop off in occupancy as cavity size increases, because this would allow more access by predators. It also could decrease the insulative properties of these cavities. And it could also just be too much decay that the cavity is just not usable anymore. And then for our tree characteristics, it's known that larger trees tend to have older and more developed cavities, which could also relate to insulation. So we can predict that as our tree size increases, our occupancy rate increases because of these insulative properties. There's probably more diversity in cavities available, and there's probably more abundance in cavities. And as trees increase in size, they're aging, they're getting older. So we can assume that they're turning into snags or dead trees, which tend to have more biodiversity in them anyways. And then next are stand characteristics. So these are more like canopy cover, ground vegetation, the habitat surrounding the tree. And so based on literature, we can predict that as canopy cover increases, our occupancy will decrease. That's because previous studies done on saw-whet owls in different forests have found that they select for areas with open cavities because there's an increase in forage opportunities, and they have an increase in the ability to hear each other's vocalizations, which can be really important during breeding season when establishing territories. So we could assume that we could see the same trend in our forest, in our study area, but until we analyze this data, we don't know. And so how we're going to do this is we're going to use cavity inventory plots. And this work is largely done by the help of our citizen scientists. We set up these 50 by 50 meter plots in the forest, and within these plots, this is where we take our canopy cover measurements. We can measure the density of the forest. Once we find cavities, we use our cavity mounted or our pole mounted cavity cameras to look inside our cavities. And the picture you see on the left is one of my techs. She's holding a painter's pole, which is what we attach our cameras to. And you can see it's extended up really high. And that cavity is pretty close to the top of that dead tree, that snag. It's located where the bark starts to be shown again. And she's able to use that pole to look into the cavity, and we can determine quality of cavity. We can measure the width of our cavity. We can measure the height of the cavity from the ground up to the where the cavity starts at the base. And then once we take all our cavity characteristic measurements, we measure the size of the tree using a DBH measurement, diameter at breast height, which essentially is just a measurement around the tree. And then we identify the species of tree. And then from our list of cavities that we found using these cavity inventory plots from 2016 to 2022, we randomly select cavities, but this is based on the quality of cavity because we found that cavities that are lower quality tend to be more degraded, and the trees are usually knocked down, and so they just weren't worth returning to. So we used higher quality cavities to monitor. And this is a map of all the cavities that we've monitored so far. This is about 150, and this is just cavities that we monitored for just this chapter. We have monitored thousands of cavities so far in the project itself, but I wanted to establish a list of 80 cavities that we could return to each season. And the reason that I settled on the number 80 is because based on literature, anything less than 75 is not statistically significant enough to determine occupancy. So we settled on number 80. So we monitored all these cavities that you can see on the map to create our list of 80. And then to determine occupancy, we're considering a cavity occupied if there's any presence of an individual or any sign of nesting by any species. And so our owl species that we study don't usually use nesting material, but we're considering other species that might be occurring within these nest cavities as well that probably do use nesting material. And so hopefully we get something like this. So these are pictures of owls in cavities. The picture on the left is an elf owl nest with some eggs. So those little golf ball looking things are eggs. And then we have a recently hatched baby in there. The picture in the center are nestlings that are getting pretty close to fledging. And then the picture on the right is an adult elf owl sitting on some nestlings. And so while we're monitoring, we'll be monitoring during early, mid, and late breeding season. So this is about from April to June. And our hope is to understand how occupancy is influenced by our stand, tree, and cavity characteristics. And these will be monitored over multiple seasons so we can be able to understand whether or not their occupancy will continue in the future or whether or not they'll use those cavities again, which is called local extinction and colonization. And so for my final chapter, I will be analyzing cavity tree and stand level characteristics that influence tree cavity microclimates. So this is saying how are all of these variables that I have listed here, so cavity height, width, and bearing, so the direction the cavity is facing, the species of the tree and the DBH or size, canopy cover, tree density, and the percent of ground vegetation. How are all these variables influencing that internal temperature of a cavity? And so based on the literature, we know that the direction that a cavity is facing can influence the internal temperature of a cavity. So we know that north-facing nest boxes have a lower internal temperature and can lag behind external temperature or ambient temperature. For tree species and our sizes, we know that larger trees have a higher rate of selection, and that the species and size of tree can affect that internal cavity temperature, and again can be a refugia and act as a buffer against those ambient fluctuations or that outside temperature. And so this is what past studies have found, but we want to know how this relates to where we're studying. So what specific tree species in our area have these characteristics that are influencing occupancy? And then, like we talked about earlier, temperatures can vary depending on tree structure and habitat type. So we would like to understand how the density of our forest and what vegetation on the ground is impacting that temperature gradient that's occurring within these forest stands. And so to do this, we collect microhabitat data. So this is ground-based data based on a single tree that has a cavity. So once we find a cavity, we take the bearing. And the bearing is essentially if you were an owl looking straight out from your cavity. And using that direction, we will add and subtract 45 degrees in either direction, which creates this quadrant. And within this quadrant, we measure out 5 to 11.3 meters. And these are not random numbers. These numbers are based on a bird field protocol that has been established. It's a standardized way of understanding habitat that occurs around a nest territory. And so within each of these radiuses, we will calculate the percentage of ground cover within each quadrant. So within that 5-meter radius, we're calculating the percentage of grass, bare ground, shrubs, and forbs. And then in that 11.3-meter radius, we're going to take the size of each tree, so measure the DBH around each tree, and then identify the size class and species, so small, medium, and large trees. And then we're also going to count the number of snags that occur. And so this is what it would look like on the ground. So we have our 5 meters in blue. That's where we'll do our percent of vegetation cover types. And then our area in red is where we will take the DBH and identify the species of tree. So in this example, we only have 2 trees to measure. And then once we've done all our habitat-based data collection, we will be deploying eye buttons in these cavities. These are temperature loggers. And we'll have them paired. So we're going to have one hanging inside the cavity and then one hanging on the outside. So the idea is to capture that internal temperature and then the immediate temperature outside the cavity. And so using cavity temperature, we can look at the daily averages, maximum and minimums, look at the nighttime and daytime temperature, and then understand seasonality as well. So how the temperature varies between early and late breeding seasons. And then we can also see how cavity temperature is influenced by cavity height, width, and bearing, the species of tree and DBH, our canopy cover, tree density, and percent of ground vegetation, and then also compare our cavity temperature to our external ambient temperatures or outside temperatures. And so this is an example of what that data will look like. So this is the average daily temperature for just one cavity. You can see our temperature range on the bottom on the x-axis ranges from late June to late September. And then we have our temperature range on the left side on the y-axis from 0 to 30 degrees Celsius. And just some things to point out here is first, our cavity temperature in blue is rising in temperature at a much gradual rate compared to the ambient temperature in orange. You can see in orange, the ambient temperature is having really big fluctuations occurring. And then here as well, we have that same trend of the ambient temperature in orange having a really big upswing in temperature compared to our cavity temperature in blue that has more of a gradual temperature change. And then again, for another singular tree, this is just for the month of June, we can look at the daytime temperatures that occur. So this is from sunrise to sunset. And you can see again, our cavity temperature is in blue, and then our ambient temperature is in orange. And one major thing to note here is that our cavity temperature is lagging behind the ambient temperature. So the cavities are experiencing a much lower average temperature compared to the ambient. And then we can also look at our nighttime comparison. So this is for the same cavity for just the month of June. And we have the opposite relationship we're having the opposite relationship occurring. So our cavity temperatures in blue are maintaining a higher temperature compared to our ambient temperature in orange. So this is just showing how these cavities can be temperature refugia and buffering against those big swings that can occur during the day. With high temperatures happening during daytime, the cavities are maintaining that lower temperature, and the lower temperatures happening during the nighttime, these cavities are maintaining a warmer temperature, which can be important, especially if you're raising young. And so overall, this work will be adding novel species information to improve management. This work will be providing baseline habitat and climate information. And so potentially we'll be able to understand shifts that are occurring. And there is also opportunities to do climate modeling to be able to see what's going to happen in the future. And then again, being able to understand how these broad scale climates are interacting on fine scale spatial features, because that is what these species are experiencing directly, is those fine scale spatial features. And so now that we've gone over the research, I'm going to talk a little bit about outreach opportunities that we have in this area. So where we work is the Southwestern Research Station. And something that's really unique about staying at this station is that we're in a really remote area, but we have access to amenities that we're used to having at home. And previous field jobs that I have required me to camp for long-term in a tent. You don't have any access to a shower unless you're camped next to a river or a stream, which you never really feel that clean anyways if you do that. You also have to know how to make food in the field, and especially food that doesn't require refrigeration. And that can be a really big learning curve if you've never done that before. And then also being cut off from the outside world. Usually these field jobs are really remote and you don't have any access to Wi-Fi or a cellular service. And so you can't contact home. And so the Southwestern Research Station provides a really welcoming and comfortable environment that's unique to a remote area. And this advantage of this location is that it can increase accessibility to the field of conservation. And a lot of students that are from underrepresented or minority backgrounds, or maybe they grew up in an urban area, or maybe they just didn't grow up how I was raised with outdoor experience, they can experience barriers to entry into the conservation field. And a lot of positions require you to have prior remote experiences. And so it's hard to gain those experiences if people won't hire you. And so the station recognizes this and does provide opportunities through its volunteer program. So that allows undergraduates to stay and work at the station, and then in return they can work with researchers. However, HawkWatch also recognizes these opportunities, and they take advantage of it by partnering with the Earthwatch Institute. And so the Earthwatch Institute brings citizen scientists out in the field with us, and they experience fieldwork and science in a more immersive experience. So they're there in the field with us, taking all of these habitat measurements that I just described. They're doing the science, they're learning how to conduct field work. And a lot of these Earthwatch participants are from urban areas, and a lot of the students who are able to come out in the field with us, this is their very first outdoor experience they've ever had. And so it can be really impactful towards them. And then for my project specifically, I have had the opportunity to bring outdoor student conservation scholars with me. And so this program is a 2-year undergraduate research program that provides undergraduates that come from underrepresented backgrounds. And many of them, this is their very first field experience. So they come out with me in the field and they're able to gain experience and be able to conduct their own research as well. And so through the Earthwatch Institute, we have our Following Forest Owls program. This has been led by Dr. Dave Olear of HawkWatch since 2016. And again, these citizen scientists come out in the field with us. And while they're there, they're in the mountain, living and working with us, and they take all the field measurements. They learn how to identify tree species, identify owl species and their calls, and they also learn how to set up mist nets and trap at night. So they're actively trapping these owls with our assistance, of course. And once we have banded and processed the owls, they each have the opportunity to have an up close and personal experience with these owls by either holding the owl, or they also get an up close look at all these adaptations that owls have that they learn about in the classroom, and then they go and experience it in the field. And then again, along with our Earthwatch teams, this area just provides so many opportunities for early career scientists. And not only does it provide a welcoming environment for students with limited or no field experience, but they have access to other researchers. So when you're living in a station for 2 months, you meet scientists with diverse backgrounds. And I've had students in the past who, on their day off, will go out in the field with somebody else doing research and have different experiences with lizards or snakes or other bird species. And we also have a canyon we also have a museum at the base of our canyon, and we got a behind the scenes look at how they're doing reptile and amphibian conservation within this museum. So there's just so many opportunities for early career students, not only just having a field experience, but having networking opportunities with other researchers as well. And then they also have access to a remote area, and they don't have to be in too rugged of an environment where they're uncomfortable. And so unfortunately, the Doris Duke program is ending. So my direct pipeline to undergraduate students who are from underrepresented groups is ending. However, I do hope to continue to take advantage of the opportunities that the station provides, especially to these early career scientists who are from these underrepresented groups, students who would not ordinarily have these opportunities provided to them because of barriers that have occurred in their life. And focusing on the students who are minorities or from urban areas or just haven't been given the chance to gain experience, they can greatly increase the diversity within conservation. And this is an advantage to the field of conservation because not only are they bringing their own life experiences, but we should also be welcoming everyone into this world because we're all a part of nature, and everyone should be welcome to experience and learn about the work that we're doing and how we're helping these species of owls. And so lastly, I just want to acknowledge some people and groups that have assisted me in the work I've done. So the Bridge to Doctorate program allowed me to go from an undergraduate degree into a PhD program and form this project. The Doris Duke Scholars for being my technicians and helping me out in the field. The University of Idaho is where I'm doing my PhD through, and my advisor is Dr. Carrie Vierling. Dr. Sarah Hoagland from the U.S. Forest Service is who has provided me with my acoustic monitors through donation. And then, of course, the citizen scientists from the Earthwatch Institute who have not only helped me in the field, but have really supported me and cheered me on throughout this experience so far. And then, of course, Dr. Dave Oliar from HawkWatch International, who has allowed me to be on his project and be a part of HawkWatch and be a part of the Following Forest Owls program and helping me develop this project. And then with that, I'll ask you guys for any questions.
Cassandra, you nailed it on the time there. We have exactly 14 minutes left, which is about how much time we wanted to leave for that. So I think everybody was listening so attentively that they haven't dropped questions into the chat. So we'll give everybody a few minutes here. And so if you're just joining us, or if this is your first program with us, you don't have access to audio or video. We're in webinar mode, so you will have to type your questions into the chat. But I'm happy to field those to Cassandra if you have them. No questions yet, but Machiko says that they hope that you know how incredible you are and that you're doing great work, Cassandra.
Thank you. That's really kind.
And I saw Lucy had their hand raised. So Lucy, if you want to type your question in, we'll get to it. Mackenzie wants to know how sensitive the monitors are that you're utilizing in the field, Cassandra.
Yeah, so that's been one thing that I am hoping to figure out. So how I'm putting these out in the field is based on the Western screech owl territory size. And so we're making sure that they're greater than 100 hectares apart, which is roughly a Western screech owl territory. Just because for some reason, Wildlife Acoustics, who provides these monitors, don't say what the range is of how much sound they can detect. So I'm trying to limit how much duplicate detections we're having by just spacing them out more. As for the sensitivity, these monitors were originally created to detect bat sounds. So they can detect sounds at a frequency that humans can't even hear. And since they were made to detect bat noises and calls, that technology is way more advanced. And so it's crazy what these monitors can do. They can like real time already identify species of bats just based on the calls. So maybe someday they'll get there for birds, which would be great and make my life a lot easier. But overall, the sensitivity of these monitors, depending on what type of monitor you get and what it's for, they can be really sensitive.
Awesome. Well, hopefully that answered your question, Mackenzie, but if you have any follow-ups, let us know. All right, this one should be pretty straightforward to answer, but we'll see. Steve wants to know why there are so few pygmy owls in the area.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, we are actively surveying at night, and since they are more active during the day, we just don't get responses from them. So that's how we're detecting our owls is through our nighttime surveys mostly. And so anytime we've really come across a pygmy owl has been luck because we just randomly hear them in the forest. So they just might not be as abundant. We are going to start actively monitoring for them more during the day, and hopefully our detection can be increased using these acoustic monitors. But this area is just so big, it's just so hard to be able to constantly be looking for them, and we just really need to increase our understanding about where they're occurring, and it's just really hard because they might not be as abundant as the other species.
And I'll put in a shameless plug here that I'm sure Kassandra would be happy to put out more of these passive acoustic monitors with more support there. So if you're interested, let us know. We'd be happy to chat with you about that. Lucy asks what effect the woodpeckers have on the owls.
Yeah, so they have well, cavity wise, the woodpeckers are the ones creating the cavities. So their effects on owls is really important. The more cavities there are, the more owls that can occur. Otherwise, I have seen cavities that woodpeckers have created and nested in and then didn't use the next year, and then an owl moved in, and then the following year the woodpeckers are back. So there's always competition occurring within these cavities. Why? I don't know. I can't tell you. Maybe I can tell you at the end of my research, but right now I'm not sure what it is that's causing them not to return one year and then return the next. We actually had a cavity at the station on station grounds that was used by a pygmy owl. And then now all of a sudden the woodpeckers have taken their cavity back and they've been there the past few years. So there's definitely a lot of competition occurring over these cavities.
To me, this really, your answer to this question, Kassandra, really emphasizes something that we try to talk about a lot with this program is that a lot of these questions we don't know the answers to because there just hasn't been enough research, right? We call these knowledge gap species for that reason. So yeah, really excited to see everything that Kassandra learns through her research and that we learn more broadly through the bigger program, but still lots to learn. What about predation? And Andrew specifically is wondering if we've noticed any predation by great horned owls.
Yeah, so like I said, our western screech owls are biggest owl, and the elf owl is the smallest owl. And so there can be predation that occurs just within our small forest owls. Great horned owls are known to eat smaller birds, including our sad forest owls. Unfortunately, I have never directly seen any predation. However, when we're doing callback surveys at night, if we have a great horned owl that comes in, we're done. We don't want to provide them a meal. So there is predation that occurs, but I've never like directly seen it. And we also like try to limit how much of a meal we provide for them. So if we hear them, we stop. But they doing our nighttime surveys sometimes can bring them in. So we just have to be careful about that. But usually it doesn't happen and we're fine.
Well, you got another kudos that I want to share from Devlon. A great, well-rounded presentation, and just some thanks for your work to help these amazing species. Elizabeth wants to know what, if with the temperature monitors, if you've ever had the equipment damaged by the owls themselves.
So I haven't had equipment damaged by owls. However, I have a vendetta. Kirsten's laughing because she knows what I'm gonna say, against the Mexican Jays because they steal my iButton temperature loggers all the time. They like shiny, pretty things. I don't know why. And so it's so frustrating because they steal them. And I am hoping and praying one day I come across a nest that just has all of my temperature loggers that they've stolen them. That's the only real damage I've experienced so far. A little bit of on my acoustic monitors, I've had a little bit of munching on my like they have like a little sound buffer thing on the microphone. So something likes to chew on those. But other than that, I haven't had much damage.
It's a shame they don't make air tags or some sort of tracker small enough that we can put them on those, Cassandra, so we can find them for you. Of course, there's such little cell service anyway. So, all right, Lynn is wondering what are the fluctuations in what owls eat?
Yeah, so our flammulateds, our elf owls, and our whiskered screech owls are insectivores, so they primarily eat insects. Our other owl species, so our northern pygmy owls, the western screech owl, and the saw-whet owls, they will eat both insects and small lizards, and sometimes small mammals. So we've caught owls with like a mouse in hand before, which is pretty cool.
I'm going to do a last call for questions. We're running out of time together, sadly, and I want to give Cassandra her time back. She is a PhD student, and it is final season. We're really glad she took time to join us tonight. Do you have a comment from Mackenzie that they're not sure what mammals are in the area, but they've had issues with deer chewing on battery wires? So.
Yeah, always a pain. You never know. And then once you figure out one thing, it's always something else that's messing with something. So just what happens in the field.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing any last questions. So I think that we'll wrap things up here with Elizabeth wishing you good luck on finals. Cassandra, I think we all do. And just thanks for sharing your time and your expertise with everyone. There is a link in the chat if you're interested in learning more about the expeditions and maybe joining Cassandra in the field in 2024. It's a lot of fun. I've done it twice now. I've had that great privilege and I'd recommend it to anyone. And if you have any questions, please let us know. We'd be happy to answer those. Okay. Thanks again, Cassandra. Thanks y'all for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.